Let's go.
Let's go. Oh, no.
Do you want to?
Sorry. I'll let you.
Next one.
I'm excited and I feel relaxed and I'm ready to party. Don't say sorry. You don't need to do that. You don't need to apologize. It's a fucked up female habit. You don't need to be sorry for anything ever. Can you guess what every woman's worst nightmare is?
I don't have rage issues!
I have nothing to prove to you. When I'm good, I'm very good. But when I'm bad, I'm better.
I say when it comes to stardom and Lauren, there are no accidents.
Hi, Karen Peterson.
Hello and welcome to Citizen Dame, the podcast where one of us is just a little bit older today and definitely wiser. Happy birthday,
Definitely.
Lauren Humphreys Brooks.
Thank you. Thank you.
How's
Yes.
your day going?
My day has been just lovely. Other than the fact that New York was almost swept away by the flood. I am still here, which we are very grateful for. So is New York, as far as I can tell. Have not been into Manhattan, but you know, hopefully it's still there.
Yeah, it's interesting being on the other side of the country and not really understanding the geography and just seeing what's on the news here. It seriously looks like New York is underwater and everyone's in danger. And so that's not the case.
No, I do. I mean, those are real. That's real footage, and definitely, I've seen some people who live in other areas of Brooklyn and live in Queens, posting videos of like their streets, etc. And it was bad in certain places. I happen to live in one of the heights in Brooklyn, and that means I think that at one point I think I looked it up. I believe I live in on the highest point in Brooklyn, literally.
Oh.
So when it comes to stuff like flooding, that's usually not the problem for me.
Like if it's flooding at your house, then there's a real serious problem, right?
Then Manhattan is submerged, to be totally honest. Like
wow.
if it starts flooding here, Manhattan is no longer there. Manhattan is lower, like in terms of sea level, right? Manhattan is lower, and yeah, it sounds like it got pretty freaky over there yesterday, and no one was really expecting it either.
It's crazy. It's
Yeah.
crazy. Yeah. Well, no weather here. It's a little bit cooler and definitely cloudy, but it's a very nice day here in Southern California. So,
well, it's supposed to be gorgeous here tomorrow. It's supposed to be like 75 and sunny. I'm really looking forward to it.
well, that sounds like a nice day.
Yes.
Well, good. I'm glad that you are doing okay and that you're having a good birthday.
Yes, thank you. Thank
So
you. I'm old now.
Yeah. Yep. But you're wise and distinguished.
I'm wiser. Yes, sure. That's how everyone describes me.
Yes. Definitely no one ever says anything rude about you, ever.
No.
All right. So it is the last day of September, which means by the time you're listening to this, it will be October. And that means it is spooky movie season. We look forward to this all year long. And we've got some great stuff coming this month. But we're also kind of, bidding farewell to back to school time. So this week we decided to dive into the Criterion collection, or the Criterion channel was doing a high school horror collection this month. And so we decided to pick a couple of movies from that group and talk about them. So it's kind of a nice transition between school movies and the spooky movies. So today we're going to be talking about the 1976 film Massacre at Central High. We'll also talk about witches with The Craft and some more slasher fun with I Know What You Did Last Summer. So those are the movies that we're going to be talking about. But before we get into anything specific, Lauren, why do you think that high school is such a perfect setting for horror movies?
Because it's high school. I mean, one of the things that we've talked about like throughout this conversation, but also so we've recorded bonus episodes on Heathers and on The Faculty, right? And so we've talked about it we've talked about this in that context as well, that high school is, first of all, where all of the emotions run very high.
Mm-hmm.
And And also people are dicks. Like one of the things, even just in watching these three films, it's just like, on the one hand, I'm like, this is not exactly my high school experience, obviously. But also high schoolers, it's like the hormones or something has just gotten moving so quickly that people are just assholes to each other in ways that you're just like, why are you doing that? What is the point of this? And I do think that it kind of lends itself to horror. I think that particularly, definitely with at least one of the films that we're talking about, there is that element of coming of age and of being, again, one of the things we've spoken about some of the other high school movies we talked about is that kind of liminal space between being an adult and being a child, being more grown up, but also not being grown up at all, that kind of tension. And that exists in all three of these films, even though even though none of the actors are high school age particularly. But I also think that there's a little bit of adults projecting and like remembering their high school experiences as being a lot worse than they actually were. And so being like, I hated high school. These were the kinds of people that pissed me off. So I'm going to make a movie about it. So I think that there's all of that kind of happening.
A little bit of wish fulfillment in that, like, oh, I hated that girl. She was so horrible to me. So I'm going to create a character where that girl gets brutally butchered.
Exactly.
Yeah. There's also, of course, we've talked about this a little bit too, where, some, especially earlier, like slasher movies and stuff with movies like Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, there's also a little bit of that like cautionary, like, don't do sex, kids, type of thing too. So we get some of that, and high school is the right age for that, because once you get into college, then, you are legally an adult, if not, if not emotionally one.
Well, and you do have to say all three of the films that we're talking about are directed by men and I believe written by men.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because a lot of them are very focused on female characters. And so I think there's also that kind of exploitation element and the kind of prurient interest in, particularly in the first film we're going to talk about, women going topless all of a sudden for no particular reason. And so there is that sort of enjoyment of like wanting to both victimize and objectify these young bodies, basically.
Yeah, that's true. So let's jump into our first movie, Massacre at Central High. I think this was a first time watch for both of us. So when the high school horror selection hit Criterion, I was like, oh, I gotta check this out. I've heard about this movie. I heard it was the movie that inspired Heathers. And that is definitely the case. You can really see it. But I wasn't fully prepared for what I was about to watch. This movie is a little bit wild. And so when we were talking about doing this topic, I was like, maybe before we settle on our movies, you should watch it too. So I'm glad that you did, because I think this is one that we definitely had some thoughts about. But the basic premise of this movie, which came out in 1976 and was written and directed by Renee Daalder. This is about this guy who has just transferred to a new high school and immediately sees who the bullies are and sees all the different cliques in the school and starts doing something about it in the simplest terms. So Lauren, what were your thoughts in general about Massacre at Central High?
So like both the Criterion description and some of the other commentary on this film kind of pushes this idea of it being this political allegory. And I got halfway through the film and I was just like, what the fuck are you people talking about? And then the film actually does kind of switch tactic a little bit. And I think it does go to some really interesting places in this, like the second half, right? But the first half is just bad. I mean, it isn't terribly good acting. It's not terribly good directing.
It's actually terrible acting.
Yeah, it's very, very stilted. and
Yes.
very like, it reminded me a lot of a very different film called I'm certain that people have seen this, Deathbed, The Bed That Eats. And there's a scene in Deathbed where like a guy's hands get burnt off so that they're just skeleton like fingers, and he's totally nonplussed about it, totally like, huh, oh, that happened, like, and it's not even shock, it's just like, is there no reaction at all to the fact that your hands were just melted off? And this film, like, so much of it reminded me of that. Like, there's this, it's just such an odd combination of like, oh, those people are like dying. and then like natural reactions, some others just like, oh, that's really horrible. But then like people are like, a locker just exploded. Is no one gonna adjust that? Like, no, okay.
Yeah. Teachers don't care.
Well, and you've got all this elements, like there are almost no adults, like there are no teachers featured. No one seems to be in charge of these kids whatsoever. All of the kids are in their 20s, they like, obviously. And yeah, it's very, very odd. And I do think that in the second half it begins to go to interesting places after kind of the destruction of the bullies, right? And then moving into like this, I think it's an awful stretch to call it a political allegory. It's trying to be one, maybe.
Yeah.
And it's definitely trying to kind of address certain things that are allegorical and about violence and about fascism. I also have to say that I think there's something just very odd about the whole opening where like the guy is gonna defend this dude played by Robert Carradine who's being bullied, but he's being bullied for like drawing a swastika on a locker. And I was sitting there going like, so whose side am I supposed to be on in this situation? Because I kind of feel like the bullies might have a point here.
Yeah. That was my reaction too. It was like, wait, even in the 70s, I'm pretty sure that drawing swastikas was not okay and that it was perfectly fine to tell someone meanly, don't do that.
don't do. Yeah, it's just like, and then the bullies like show themselves to be really bad people, right? And I'm like, so are we on the side of swastika drawing guy? Is that what we're supportive of him? Okay.
Free speech, Lauren. Free speech.
It's very that's the thing. It's so hackneyed and so like it tries to bludgeon you with its point, but it's very confused about its own point, I think.
Yeah, I just pulled up the Criterion Channel's plot summary, just because I was like, because I remember thinking it was when I was watching it, like that doesn't quite match the summary. So just so we can be on the same page about what we're talking about here, this is how it is described if you pull up the Criterion Channel to watch this movie. This powerful blend of social commentary and exploitation is one of the premier genre films of the 1970s and a provocative allegory about fascism and power structures in a high school world where adults are absent. When new student David arrives at Central High, he discovers that it is lorded over by a gang of bullies who rule the school through intimidation and violence. David's friend Mark encourages him to join this dominant clique, but instead, David stands up for their victims, and the gang cripples him in retaliation. Soon, oh yeah, we'll talk about that in a second too. Soon, David begins taking steps to end their reign of terror permanently, setting in motion an explosive cycle of killing that may not end until no one is left to graduate.
I mean, I always take the Criterion descriptions with a grain of salt, especially when they take like an exploitation film from the 1970s and say something like that about it, because I'm like, is this true? Like, let's be honest about what this film actually is here, guys.
Yeah. But I do think, sorry.
Well, I was just gonna say, but this has gained a great deal of notoriety. Like Roger Ebert is like, oh, this is an intelligent film, which I think is, again, question mark there, Roger.
I think it's one of those examples where people can find deeper meaning if they're looking for it. You can do that with just about anything. And I think this is one of those examples where people have done it. And it's not, I agree with you. I think that the writer director, Renee Daalder, I think that that was what he intended. I think he wanted it to be this deep social commentary that like really has a lot to say about high school teenage bullying and you know standing up to them and standing up for the little guy, but I don't think that he does it successfully.
Mhm.
I think that he just, because of the blemishes all over this, I think that it ends up kind of derailing from his own point. And one of the big issues, the sorry, one of the big things that does distract from that is wonky acting, questionable reactions to things, or no reaction to things. Like it mentions David getting crippled in this accident, and it's like just the way that he's quote unquote crippled is almost embarrassingly bad. It's like
Mhm.
it's not depicted well. And so it's like, because it is this kind of cheesy, really like low budget movie, it becomes a distraction from its own point.
Yeah.
And so it never, I do believe that he was trying to make something smart. I do not believe that he accomplished it.
Yeah, that's the thing, and it's so all over the place. And I think that, so I mentioned the random nudity,
Mhm.
particularly of the female characters, but there's also some like random male nudity going
Yeah.
on there as well. So props to that.
Mhm.
Um, but and that's where it edges more into the exploitation genre, which you give directors credit for having to like work within certain parameters and trying to make something interesting out of a genre that is very much dependent upon blood and breasts, basically.
Right.
But that it like also, as you're saying, that also distracts kind of from the actual point. Like what's the point? There's so much of this that feels unintentionally humorous,
Mhm.
and it doesn't feel like one of those films that has an awareness of its schlock. And so I've been watching a number of Roger Corman films recently, and Corman's films sometimes are like ridiculously schlocky and are sometimes really really well made. But there's an intentionality behind most of his work that like he knows what kind of film he's making at any given moment. I don't think this film knows what it's supposed to be. I don't think the director knows what kind of film he's making. He's trying to do something that seems very intelligent, but the script doesn't have that intelligence.
Yeah.
Right, it's too heavy-handed on the one hand, and then you've got these moments of unintentional humor, like where boulders crush people.
Oh my gosh, I was laughing so hard at that. Like, oh no, look out.
Well, and it's funny, and I'm sitting
Yeah.
there going like, is this supposed to be funny? But if it's supposed to be funny, then what's the point? Like what is the underlying purpose to the humor, right? Because it's not really contributing to the argument that the film appears to be making.
Mm-hmm.
The shift that I did think had a lot of potential and just never completely followed through on it was, after the destruction of the bullies, you get a shift in the social dynamic of the high school.
Right.
And people beginning to behave like bullies, like the bullies were, because without this kind of overarching control that this overarching terror that these guys imposed on the school, they didn't have any particular direction. One of the problems that I had with this is that as the film went on, I was like, is this an argument for fascism? Because it seems like the bullies, as bad as they were the ones that were keeping everybody in line and stopping them from becoming even worse.
Yeah.
And so it was very like, and the bullies do horrible things. So I'm like, what is your argument here? Like, what's your thesis?
I get the sense like certain movies sometimes the writing for whatever reason isn't coming together. When they're in the process of filming, it's like, well, we're trying to get there. And so there's this idea where some people are like, well, we'll find it in the editing room. Like the movie will come together once we have all the footage and we can start to really cut it into an actual cohesive film. And I kind of felt like that's what they thought they could just do here, was like, we're just gonna do a bunch of random stuff and then just see what we can find once we assemble it. And so that's, I think, why it's uneven, why it's weird. Certain things just don't flow together at all. And then it tries to do, this like kind of this commentary. But because of the fact that it doesn't really know what its own point is, it's never able to make one. It's trying to be too many things, so it ends up not being anything. And whereas, like I had mentioned, this is a film that heavily influenced Heathers, which we did a whole episode on, so I'm not going to like rehash that or relitigate it. But like Heathers, whether you love it or hate it, it has a clear point of view, and it I think does a good job of making its point, which is also not necessarily like trying to champion something. It's very much, this is a dark comedy about a dark character who does something that seems to be like what everybody wants. Like, yeah, this benefits everyone, but also it kind of doesn't. And it's very clear about that. I don't think it gets muddled in whether it's trying to turn Christian Slater into a hero or a villain.
Yeah, no, not at all. It's very, like you say, it's very focused. It knows what it's doing. And it does have that like kind of middle act shift, right?
Yeah.
Where, and it plays with the audience's expectations, and it plays with the audience's sympathies, which is what I think Massacre at Central High is trying to do very much. That you have sympathies for this group of characters, and particularly for David, who's played by Daryl Morey. And then there's a shift that happens, and you kind of begin to see things a little bit differently, or maybe like, well, maybe this is not such a good thing.
Right.
And that definitely happens in Heathers, and that definitely happens in Massacre at Central High. But like you say, Heathers knows what it's doing with that sympathy shift, and knows what the character is. The character doesn't really change. Like Christian Slater's character doesn't really change.
Right.
He just becomes kind of more focused on the murder that he wants to commit. Whereas it feels like, there's supposed to be this shift with David's character, right? And weirdly enough, for the guy who's kind of supposed to be the protagonist, for lack of any better term, it stops focusing on him once you get that, like, his injury, and and I swear to God, he limps on a different leg.
Oh, yes,
in
totally.
Several different
he
scenes.
keeps switching legs.
He keeps, okay, good. I was just like, was I wrong? I swear to God, he does it in a scene as he's walking at one point. And I'm like, can you please decide which leg you crushed?
And
Just
I kind
choose
of
one.
like, part of me, and this is not me trying to like figure out how to make this work, because I do think that they just screwed that up. But part of me was like thinking for a minute, is it supposed to be that he was injured on both legs? You really can only limp once at on one leg at a time. But no, I don't. I think they just, I think they clearly needed a script supervisor to pay attention to those kinds of things, and they did not have that.
I do give him credit though. He manages to go down those stairs on one foot really quickly. Yeah. Like I was just like, that is impressive that he did not just face plant. Like, I'm, I give him credit on that. But that's the thing, that sympathy shift, which really should happen, right, in the middle of the film, never completely happens because he's not a very well realized character.
Yeah.
And you've got this like undercurrent of, him talking about, where do you put your anger, right? And just like, well, I run. And it's like, okay, that's fine. Like, he's like maybe this very angry guy, but he gets it out through physical activity. And then when he's injured, he can no longer do that. And so he turns to much darker things. But it's never followed through on. It's never like, oh, let's actually look at the psychology of this dude. It's just like, oh, David's like a serial killer now.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And very good, and a bomb expert, like props to David on that. He's just learning things.
Yeah, I want to know the real reason he left his last high school.
Seriously.
Oh goodness. Any other thoughts about Massacre at Central High?
it's it's a mess. I did enjoy watching it, to be
Mhm.
honest. Like once it kind of got to but there are a couple of points where I was just like, this is just gratuitous. Why are we gonna have this like attempted rape scene in the middle of this movie? Although I have to say that what's her name's reaction to it is quite fascinating. I think it's Teresa.
Yeah.
She like goes to the room and sits down to watch them, and it's like, what is happening in
I
this
know.
movie? What is going on here? I
I
don't know
understand.
I don't know how to deal with this. And that's the point at which I was like, okay, David might be the only sane one in this entire group, where he's like, hey, stop that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just, yeah, it's kind of interesting as sort of a curiosity, and maybe its influence on later better films, but
Yeah.
that's pretty much it as
Yeah,
far as
it's
I'm
definitely
concerned.
worth your time to watch it, but don't expect a sharp political allegory.
And people
Oh,
just blowing up like Looney Tunes characters, like
oh, yeah, so fun. Okay, so from 1976, we jump forward 20 years to 1996 with The Craft, which is a movie I first saw in 1996 and watched again yesterday. uh
wow.
I don't know why. I don't know. I just had never gotten around to watching it again. I liked it when I saw it. It wasn't like, ew, I hate that movie. I don't want to watch it again. It was just I don't know. I think I've seen bits and pieces of it, but I haven't sat down and watched it start to finish since,
Mhm.
like the theater. So anyway, The Craft stars Robin Tunney as a new girl in town. She's just I think her parents like just moved, her dad relocated his job or something. And so she's new to it's like this whole thing with kids being new to the school. Um so she starts at a Catholic school and pretty immediately meets three girls that are played by Rachel True, Nev Campbell, and Fairuza Balk. Um, and that was something I had completely forgotten before I started rewatching this. Was like, I totally forgot Nev Campbell and Skeet Ulrich are in this movie.
Really?
Yeah, I had completely forgotten because I just associate them with Scream. I forgot Nev Campbell had done another high school horror movie. So, yeah.
Fairly close to Scream too, isn't it?
Yeah.
Scream
Yeah.
is like 97, something like that, 98.
The first Scream I think was 96.
Really? So it's the same year.
Now I gotta look. Yeah, 96. They both came out in 96. I
Wow.
think Scream was in December. So, um, something like that. So The Craft would have come out first. And then that's probably why I don't remember, because then Scream came out and it was like all about Sidney Prescott. So,
Mhm.
yeah. Anyway, um, so what are some of the things that draw you to The Craft? What are some things you like about this movie?
Well, I saw The Craft for the first time. I did not see it when it came out. I remember in like middle school and high school, people like it being one of those things that kind of lingered in the back of my mind as like, ooh, it's the goth kids, right? And then it just like completely forgot about it. And so the first time I watched it was actually just a couple of years ago.
Hmm.
So I have a more immediate experience of it. I It's a really interesting film in a lot of ways, and I do think it's a very imperfect film, but it does get at that high school cliquishness and bullying, and particularly through the eyes of these girls, right? And so you very much, again, talking about middle of the film or third act switches, you very much sympathize with them for most of the film. And it is that kind of like, that's that like we said earlier, that high school fantasy of these people were mean to me, I want to get back at them.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then of course it begins to spiral outward from that, because you can't take on that kind of power without paying something for it, as so many of these films tell us. But it does kind of highlight, how nasty people can be in high school, and how you want to sort of push back against that. And all of the girls, I think, do a really good job of playing their characters. I mean, Farusha Balk is like the standout. I think that she was kind of the one who got a lot of the attention, even more so than Robin Tunney, because she was just this very fascinating, highly on edge character that you're just like, oh, it's just going to take a little tiny push to send her absolutely bonkers. And she goes bonkers really, really well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very entertaining film, I think. I do think that it's disappointing in some ways, because that shift happens and it stops being fun, but it also stops being cohesive. It's like there's a scene missing somewhere in the midst of all of this, that you go from like this coven, right, who are gaining all of these powers, and then suddenly we really need to care about Robin, and we really need to care about her asshole not really boyfriend who dies partway through the film, and we're supposed to give a shit about him, and I'm just like, I don't really, actually. I think that he deserved it.
I mean, he did try to rape her.
Well, exactly.
So...
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that that's where the film, like, that's the point at which I think the film begins losing it.
Mm-hmm.
It loses some of its cohesiveness, because there's even one point where the Robin Tunney character says, oh, I think he was actually probably a nice guy underneath it all. I'm just like, no, he wasn't. At no point throughout this entire fucking movie has he shown himself to be actually a nice guy at all.
Right.
He's been an asshole the entire time. Even when he's like bewitched and obsessed with you, he's still an asshole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well,
like, he doesn't even turn into a nice guy.
No, never at any point.
Bewitched.
Never at any point. And I think that's one of the things where I think that so it's tricky. I don't like we've talked about this a lot. I don't think that every movie about female protagonists needs to automatically be written and directed by women.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think there are lots of male directors, male story writers who do a good job of depicting women, depicting their experiences. And I think that a lot of the craft does do a good job of like really communicating that kind of tumultuous relationship between teenage girls, the ups and downs of it, the complicated nature of that relationship. But I think also there are certain choices made, particularly in relation to Robin Tunney's Sarah and Skeet Ulrich's Chris. I think that with a woman writing this story, directing this movie, that would have played out much differently. And I don't think that at any point, like, it would have been more focused on trying to make him pay rather than trying to like mentally rehabilitate his image, which is basically what Sarah does when she says, oh, I think deep down he was really nice. And she wants him to be obsessed with her. It's like, I would want that guy to be the fuck away from me and every other girl. Like if I was going to bewitch him, it wouldn't be to make him love me and be nice to me. It would be to make him do things to make up for his shitty behavior. And this is very much a male fantasy storytelling by having it focused that way.
And I think that that's one of the problems with the film, is that it does some things very, very well. And I agree with you. I think that it gets at kind of the cliquishness relationship between girls at that age. And particularly in a space where this is represented as being a very cliquish high school, right? Mm-hmm. So you've got like very insular groups, and Sarah, when she's initially introduced, is kind of outside of all of that. She could probably fall into a whole bunch of different groups if she wanted to. And she winds up falling into this group with these girls and really finding a camaraderie and friendship, et cetera, with them. and power, and that's the thing. And so they begin dressing, in the cool goth outfits and all of that, but people still are kind of frightened of them. They think that they're creepy and things like that. And so I think that the film does that element really well. But it's like it introduces all of these elements of like female power and the power of women and girls in particular, like hormonal girls, 16, 17-year-old girls together. Mm-hmm. And the way in which they can really cause a lot of havoc, but also be very supportive and very intensely related to each other. And it's like it goes so far down that road, and then it's suddenly like, oh, this is really scary. Like, I really don't like this. It does feel very male at a certain point. I'm like, I don't like the idea of girls ganging up on me, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And so it has to punish them. And it has to kind of separate them and say, like, okay, the good girl, the one who's the least kind of invested in all of this, the good witch, as it were, has to in some way stop the bad evil witches and break up the coven and all of that stuff. And yeah, it seems to lose its way in that third act. And it's around about the time where Chris attempts to rape Sarah, and then the reaction of all of the girls. And one of the most interesting, I think, scenes actually is the reaction of the Fruscia Balk character. I'm trying to remember her name.
Nancy.
Nancy. So her response, there's been this whole thing about like she's a little bit jealous of Sarah, and there's been this undercurrent that like she's into Chris, or she's had a relationship with Chris, and he's kind of thrown her over, right? But that's not the way, and I've now seen this film a couple of times, that is not the way I read her reaction when Sarah tells them what happened. Mm-hmm. Her reaction seems to be, fuck that guy, like I'm gonna fuck him up.
Yeah.
And it's very much the reaction of a girl when you find out that one of your friends has been hurt. And you're just like, I'm going to ruin his life. Like, that's what I'm going to do. And, maybe that's giving Nancy's character a little too much credit, but that's kind of where the direction that she's going in. Like, she is screwing up all kinds of shit for him to the point of like actually trying to kill him. Right.
Right.
And it doesn't feel like it's self-serving to her. It feels like you've messed with one of my friends, and now I'm going to destroy your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that was my impression.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think that, so I feel like out of all of the characters in this movie, Nancy is the one that feels the most honest and realistic. And she's also very much the most interesting too, and that's major credit to Fruscia Balk. But also I think that she is a well-written character. I mean, this is a girl who doesn't have the same things that the rest of the kids in the school have. She lives in not a nice house. She has, bad family dynamics. She just has a lot rougher life. And so when she has this friend who has more and has, parents, even though it's her stepmother, but it's her stepmother who's been here her whole life. Like, she has parents who obviously care, even though, true to the horror high school movie thing, like their parents are not really around. But there's just so much about Sarah's life that Nancy craves. And yet she also is still able to see a little bit of like where it's not perfect and it's not happy. And so I feel like it's not just about Nancy Nancy being jealous of what Sarah has to the point of like wanting it. She also is still capable of seeing that Sarah's life isn't perfect, that there are cracks in it, that there are things that are not something that you would covet. And that, I think, is part of why she's such an interesting character.
Yeah, absolutely. She's and again, I think that's why the third act bothers me a bit, because she's sort of pushed into this role as the antagonist when she's not really, like, and it is that that conflict that I think develops between someone who is jealous, but also does begin to care about the person. Like there's kind of a back and forth going on, that this is a girl who's been bullied, she's been mistreated, she's in a space that she's just not happy. She doesn't have a great life.
Right.
And she's looking for a way to, a way to gain power, and a way to like actually gain some degree of control over her own existence. And then that can go many different ways. And I understand why the film goes in the direction that it does, but I just feel like it's a disservice. I think it could have been complicated more.
Mhm.
I think at the end of the day, I think that like the final conflict between them can absolutely happen, but it does not need to happen in the way that it does.
Yeah. And I think that's where your point about it feels like there's something missing. There's a connective scene missing that could really make it more clear why it escalates to the point that it does,
Yeah.
rather than going a different direction.
Well, and it would have been nice to see also more development of the Nev Campbell and Rachel True characters, because
Mhm.
again, they're sort of set up, and so you've got and again, I'm bothered a little bit by asking to feel sympathy for the racist girl
Yeah.
who says all of this nasty shit. And the worst thing that happens to her, I'm not saying it's not a bad thing, but the worst thing that happens to her is that she loses her hair.
Right.
Like that's what happens, right? She's not killed. No one
Mhm.
murders her.
Yeah.
No one like, tortures her or anything like that. And it's this kind of karmic element to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet we're still supposed to feel almost more sympathy for her than we are for this black girl who, as far as I could tell, is one of the only black girls in the entire school.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure she's
bullied,
the only. Yeah.
Who's been bullied, and it's implied has been bullied for a very long time.
Right.
By this girl. And so I think that what the film is trying to do is to sort of say, if you begin bullying, you become the bully kind of thing. But it's kind of going about it in a way that becomes a little uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It takes
and
a similar misstep to, although very different, and this is a much better movie, but it takes a similar misstep to Massacre at Central High.
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Yeah, it doesn't. I don't know. It doesn't treat some of its secondary characters as people, I guess. And again, I think that you can make those sorts of elements complicate those elements, right? Make those themes really come out more, that maybe I don't really want violent vengeance on my bullies.
Right.
Maybe that's not actually something that I want. And I think that that's the direction that the film is going, but you can do it in a much more complicated way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the film again misses a step there.
Yeah, I agree. But any other thoughts about The Craft?
It's a good film. It's one of those films that was so influential on kind of high school culture in the 90s and the aughts. Almost like external to its actual subject matter. Because I remember people talking about Fairuza Balk and like just her being this ideal of some of the goth and emo kids. And it's just like, okay, but you know what happens to her, right? Like you know what happens in the movie. She's not the good guy, really.
Right.
But it has taken on this kind of cult status that seems to exceed the qualities of the film itself, which says something about the film. It says that it spoke to people in a very clear and definite way. And it is a lot of fun. Like third act notwithstanding, it's a very well done film. I enjoy watching. One of my favorite scenes actually is the light as a feather, stiff as a board scene. Yeah. Because I remember playing that but yes, teenage girls are always one step away from being witches. Like I am absolutely convinced of that.
Yeah, totally.
I remember playing that, and I remember doing the whole thing. Like, yeah, it's very satisfying, that scene.
Yeah, well, and I love how Rachel True is the character. Rochelle, she's the one who's laying there. And I love when she's just like, guys, nothing's happening. This isn't working. And then it pulls back and she's like 3 feet off the ground. She has no idea. But yeah, I think that's another thing I just enjoy overall about the craft is these teenage girls who really crave this power, partly because of how powerless they feel in their life, but they do not understand what they're getting into. They don't understand fully what
Yeah.
what it is that they're asking for. And even when they have that conversation with the lady at the store who's explaining things like, yeah, you're gonna get it back threefold, whatever you do to somebody else. And it's like, because they haven't experienced that, they don't understand really what that means until it starts to happen. And so I like how it's this kind of it kind of does a double coming of age, because they're teenagers that are learning how to manage certain relationships and environments, but also they have this they have this inherent witch traits. At least, Sarah specifically has this clearly in her blood, and tapping into that and like learning really what it means and what this power is and how to wield it properly, it is part of what just makes it just so fun and so watchable.
Yeah, definitely. I did want the witchy woman at the store to be like, I'm not going to sell you some of this shit.
Yeah.
Like, at least be like, you know what? You're going to have to like actually steal it from me, because no, this is a bad idea. Stop. Like,
Yeah, I'm not gonna give that to you.
Older witches are supposed to do that. You're supposed to be like, nah, maybe not. Maybe we won't start summoning weird powers right now.
Yep.
Like, let's learn a little bit about the work that we're doing first.
Yep, exactly. Now, I think if this movie were now, she'd be like, you guys need to sign up for my class first and listen to my podcast, and then I will consider it.
This is why it is important to have strong female role models in your life.
Exactly. Especially when you're dabbling in the dark arts.
To teach you how to be a witch. Like,
so fun. Yeah. All right. So then our final movie today is I Know What You Did Last Summer, which came out just the next year, 1997, which is co-written by Kevin Williamson, who wrote Scream. And it was directed by Jim Gillespie. And in this one, this is kind of an urban legend sort of movie, because this takes the story of the hook wielding killer who's out killing people in the middle of the night, and but brings it to the seaside fishing town. And what happens, for anybody who needs their memory refreshed, is basically you've got these four friends, played by Jennifer Love Hewitt, Sarah Michelle Gellar, Ryan Phillippe, and Freddie Prinze Jr. And really, it's two couples. It's such a weird combination of people.
It's not, though. It's not for the 90s.
So 1997.
Like, just listening to you list that cast, just like it's the most 90s movie.
Are
so
Sarah
90s.
and Freddie still married? I know they split up at one point, but I don't think they got divorced.
I think that they're still married. The last I did check that, and they're still listed like on IMDb or whatever as being married. So
yeah, then they must be. Which good for them. That means they've been together over 20 years. That's awesome. I'm happy for them. That's wonderful. But yeah, so basically they're out. It's the 4th of July. This movie technically wouldn't be a high school movie because they just graduated from high school, presumably about 3 weeks ago. So, but they're fresh out of high school. So
they're 18 and dumb.
They are very 18 and very dumb. And they're out celebrating. Sarah Michelle Gellar's character has just won the local pageant, so she's like a beauty queen, and her boyfriend gets really drunk and refuses to give up the keys to his car until he finally kind of has to. Anyway, they end up killing somebody and hiding the body. And then the next year, someone knows what they did. And chaos ensues in the form of a fisherman wielding a hook. There's just such a fun, like this has such a fun cast. Anne Heche is in it. Johnny Galecki, Bridget Wilson.
Little Johnny Galecki. I was like, he's in this. I forgot that.
And he's an asshole. He starts off seeming so nice, and then it's like, nope, he's kind of an asshole. So anyway, yeah, so you love I Know What You Did Last Summer. I mean, I enjoyed too, but I feel like you love this movie.
Yes, I enjoy it. I think that so last year at some point I was like, I'm gonna watch a bunch of 90s slashers. I don't know why. I was just like, I just need to watch 90s slashers. So I watched I Know What You Did Last Summer. I Still Know What You Did Last Summer. I watched like the Urban
I'll
Legend.
always Know What You Did Last Summer.
I did not watch that one. I will admit that. Urban Legend. I think it was what My Bloody Valentine. Maybe not My Bloody Valentine. Whatever, the Valentine's Day prom night. Yeah. So yeah, I watched a whole bunch of those. In other words, these like this little subgenre of 90s slasher films. And I think that I Know What You Did Last Summer is kind of like the little brother or little sister to Scream, right? It's not as arch and meta, obviously. I don't think it's as good a film as Scream, but it's very 90s. It's very like it brings that entertainment value, I think. And talking about a film like, Massacre at Central High, which is trying to do so much and doesn't do any of it. I feel like I Know What You Did Last Summer knows exactly what it is doing and accomplishes it. It's meant to be kind of a hokey 90s slasher movie that is based on this urban legend. You've got those conversations about like, no, it's the guy with the hook for a hand. No, it's not a guy with the hook for a hand. It's the guy, it's an escaped mental patient who steals this. Like that entire conversation, which is very Kevin Williamson, is very Scream, right? But it kind of prepares you and it sort of lets you know that like this is an entertainment.
Yeah.
We're gonna watch a bunch of high school kids die, basically.
Yeah.
And it does it in a really enjoyable and entertaining way, I think. And it has a satisfying conclusion, more or less, leads you down some blind alleys. And has some very effective kills without really going overboard or spending too much time on the blood and gore. But like actually creating a really good sense of suspense, etc. So it's a very just enjoyable, straightforward 90s slasher film.
There's also not as much death as I thought there was. Like it's been a while since I've watched it. I've seen it a bunch of times. But when I was rewatching it this last week or so, I was like, oh, I feel like more people died in this movie than actually did. So but I think that each kill is so like it because it's not like just a death every 5 minutes. It's like when there are death scenes, it really is just like, yeah, this is awesome.
Well, and it builds up the suspense as well. There's a lot of like the killer targeting them without necessarily killing them initially, right?
Right.
So part of it's
playing
about,
with them.
Yeah, it's that creation of tension and the creation of fear without necessarily going all the way to kill them, because the killer it's not like Scream where the killer kind of just wants to kill people. It's the killer is killing them for a very specific reason.
Yeah, it's a revenge movie.
And is not out after 100 different people. He's out after particularly these 4 kids, and then also anybody who kind of gets in his way or might have been present.
Yeah.
And I do think that in terms of realism, the conversation when they actually hit the guy, the entire conversation that they go through is a compendium of these are the worst possible decisions you can make.
Right.
But it's a very realistic conversation in a lot of ways, especially given all of the establishment of the different characters, their different concerns and desires, their fears about what is going to happen to them. And their ages, right? So they're supposed to be 17, 18 years old.
Right.
And they make very bad choices, but very realistic bad choices.
Yeah, because they're all about to go off and start their lives. They're all planning on leaving this town, and they have places that they're going, and this incident, this accident, because it is an accident. They didn't intend to murder anybody. The guy was in the street. He really did come out of nowhere, and the only reason that they wouldn't call the police that they are in as much trouble as they're in is because Barry had been drinking and it's his car and nobody drives my car but me and everybody knows that, so they're going to assume I was driving even though I wasn't. Like you can definitely see how these very young people would go down this rabbit hole of like, I can't tell the truth to the authorities because this is going to ruin my entire life and my whole future. But what I think is good is that as they're making this decision, you know that they all know that it's wrong and they kind of have that sense, but they're just kind of, we're going to do this anyway because this is what we need to do for us. We can't change the fact that this guy's dead. So why ruin our lives too? But they definitely have feelings about that. And then seeing the way, especially Julie, the Jennifer Love Hewitt character, the way that a year later, how much this has affected her, how much this clearly affected Helen too, who went off to New York and didn't make it and was washed up before her 19th birthday. And how this trauma did ultimately in some ways ruin all of their lives anyway. The thing that they were trying to avoid still happened. And now it's further complicated by the fact that someone knows what they did and someone is trying to kill them.
Yeah, it's very much a good example of trauma, of horror as trauma. So, or trauma as horror. So like, it's this buried trauma that they all agree, like, we're going to keep this secret.
Yeah.
And we're going to push it down. We're not going to talk about it. And then it comes out in the form of the killer. Right. And in the case of this film, this isn't a supernatural killer. This is a literal slasher. Right. But at the same time, definitely from a meta-narrational perspective, it's exactly that. It's their trauma that they've tried to suppress and that has affected them, and that they can't really suppress. They can't suppress the trauma. They can't suppress the guilt of what they've done. And the only way to kind of absolve themselves at some level is that they actually have to confront the person that they murdered, supposedly.
Right.
And it, kind of admit to it. But then there's, throughout the entire film, there's this argument about like, what do? We can't. So it sets it up really well too. They can't really go to the police, right? Because if they go to the police, well, why do you think that someone's after you? Well,
yeah,
we murdered a guy last year, right? And so it just turns into this thing that spirals and works really, really effectively as a slasher film and really effectively as a horror film.
Yeah. And it's a lot of fun. And all of this works pretty well as long as you don't overthink it.
Yes, true.
Because there are certain things where I'm like, okay, I know that I'm not from a coastal fishing village, but I know enough and I've watched enough Deadliest Catch to know that all those folks know each other. And there's no way that Ray and Barry, who spend time working at the docks, wouldn't know the story about Benjamin Willis and David Egan and all that. It's also a small town. There's no way, especially when Julie and Helen go to David's house and meet his sister, and she's like, oh, it was all everybody talked about. It's like, okay, no, they were in high school, but this is a small town. If it was all everybody talked about, then they would have known about David and Susie. They would have known what happened.
Exactly. Yeah, I think what makes this such a lesser film in a lot of ways is exactly that. Like, you can't pay too close attention to it.
Right.
If you pay too close attention to it, you see the holes almost immediately. And even like, I've seen this film a couple of times now. Rewatching it this time, I was just like, I'd completely forgotten that this was what happened. Like, I realized that the story of the killer and the history behind and like what actually happened and all of that. I was like, oh yeah, that was stupid. Like, and it is stupid. It is. It's definitely, I think it's definitely in the vein of kind of those 1970s, 1980s slasher films like Prom Night, or there's another one that's I think set on New Year's Eve. I can't remember it right now, but it's like a New Year's Eve terror train or something like that. But it's similar to that, where the backstories are very wobbly and the motivation of the killer when it's revealed is just like, well, that's dumb.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, you can't think too deeply about it, but it is still very entertaining. It's still got some great not just kill scenes, but there's some really good um just tension. Like when Helen comes home and you know that the killer is in her house and like her dad is there or whatever and her sister, she goes upstairs to her room and you're like, no, the killer's there, he's gonna get you. And when she wakes up in the morning, she's not dead, she's still alive, but all of her hair has been cut off and it's like her one thing that she's so obsessed with, and that's what he takes away from her first, and like that's just such a great scene because that's not what you think is about to happen. There's a couple of fake outs where you think someone's about to die, but instead something horrible happens to them that really affects them personally before they end up getting killed later.
Yeah, it's that like you said, it's that creation of tension and the fact that there aren't actually that many deaths in a film that's a slasher film. I do want to know how the killer got the body and the crabs out of the trunk.
Yeah, that quickly without anybody seeing them.
Without anyone seeing there. That's the thing. There are times where I'm like, but did no one notice? Like there was just no one around at that moment.
That was a lot of crabs.
It was a lot of crabs.
And then it makes you wonder, maybe, possibly, they were never there in the first place, and that's just her trauma.
I mean, it's true. It's yeah. Well, and it's also that element that in the best slasher films do kind of create the sensation of a killer who is supernatural, that like there's a supernatural element to them, even though they're a real person.
Right.
And you get that in Halloween, especially, but even in Scream, like there are elements of that in Scream where you're like, how is the killer able to do what he does? And of course, we know why. We find out why at the end. But it's that little element of tension of like, is this actually like a real person or is this a fucking ghost? Because if it's a ghost, we are in deep shit.
Yeah. That changes everything.
And I also have to say, I love the fact that then they did I Still Know What You Did Last Summer, and it like takes place in the Bahamas or something like that.
During a hurricane.
And there's a hurricane, and Brandy is there, and it's not as good a film, definitely. But that's another one that I'm like, I am just delighted by how silly this is.
Oh yeah, for sure. So much fun. Oh, well, I think that's about it. Any other things you wanted to say about this movie or anything about high school horror in general?
I think that high school is a terrifying time. I am glad I actually had a pretty good time in high school, but I'm glad I'm not there anymore. I mean, there are a lot of good films, I think, in this subgenre. I believe all of the films that we talked about have been on the Criterion channel. I know that The Craft is also on Hulu, and I believe that I Know What You Did Last Summer is on HBO Max or something like that. So they are available to watch. If you haven't seen them, like if you haven't seen these films, definitely watch them. Like they're quite seminal movies. Maybe not Massacre at Central High. Like I find it very difficult to recommend that film. If you're interested in seeing a Proto Heathers, like maybe, but
I think for how influential it is, it's worth your time to watch it. But if you are going to, just know that we're not recommending this as like a great movie or a great example of the genre. Just more of like, watch what influenced the good things that you like.
It's definitely one of those films that like it would have been recommended in film school as like viewing and understand. It's in some ways it might be an important film in terms of the horror genre, but it is not a good film in terms of the horror genre. Right. Yeah.
But it's entertaining nonetheless. Almost accidentally.
It is accidentally very hilarious. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, well, that is going to wrap things up then for this week. Thank you so much for listening. We are so excited for our spooky movie month. So we're going to be talking more witches, vampires, all kinds of stuff. It's going to be a good October. But before we get to that, there's other ways that you can follow along with what we have been doing, what we are doing. And Of course, the best way to follow us is to become a subscriber, and then you get access to our bonus episodes. We actually just recorded a bonus episode of Haunting in Venice, which will be out by the time you're listening to this. So, but that's for patrons. So if you want to be a patron, you can go to patreon.com and /Citizen Dame. Sorry, patreon.com/Citizen Dame and sign up. And then you can join the ranks of Ali, Brian, Connor, Estefania, Heather, James, Judy, Karen, Carriotta, Lauren, Matt, Michelle, Monty, Nanina, Robert, Steve, Sharon, and Tao. And doing so does get you those bonus episodes. Like I mentioned, it gets you early access to the show, but it also just gives you the knowledge that you are helping keep feminist film criticism in the world. So that's what we like to do. You can also support the store, or support the show in a couple of other ways. We have our Zazzle store, zazzle.com/Citizen Dame Pod, and our Ko-Fi, ko-fi.com/Citizen Dame. If you want to know more of what we're up to and read some of our work, you can go to citizendamepod.com. And you can contact us if you want to join the conversation, add things, let us know what you're thinking about. If you have recommendations of movies you'd like us to consider talking about, you can email us, citizendamepod@gmail.com. And you can reach out to us on all the social medias. We're on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky @CitizenDamePod. And we are especially on Letterboxd these days @CitizenDame. We are a Letterboxd HQ. And that means that we get to share all kinds of extra stuff. So if you're on Letterboxd, definitely go over there and give us a follow. And if you're not on Letterboxd, you should check it out. It's a lot of fun. It's a great place for people who like movies. You can also reach us individually. Lauren, where are you?
I am on all of the various socials at LH Business.
And I am as well, especially Letterboxd and Instagram at Karen M. Peterson. So thank you all so much for listening, and we will catch you next time.
Bye.
No, don't even. He was there, god damn it, and he was wearing your jacket, Barry.
Where'd he go? Did the crabs carry him away?
I swear to God. I believe you. He took the body. He came here. He took the body.
Why would he do that?
I don't know, Barry. Okay, why would he try to run you over? Why did he make coleslaw on Helen's head? He's fucking with us.
Come on, Julie. Let's go back to the house.
Where's your jacket, Barry? Don't you see? He's got us now. Okay, this is exactly what he wants. We can't go to the police. Not now. He's made sure of that. He's just out there and he's watching us and waiting. What are you waiting for, huh?